this computer. All right. Well, shalom aleichem to all of our friends that are joining us to discuss Hebrew grammar through implicit learning and elaborative encoding. I'm joined by the illustrious, the famous, maybe infamous, Dr. Jeff Griffin of New Orleans Seminary. He is the librarian and Hebrew guru, in my opinion. And so together, he and I wrote this textbook that we're advertising, and we hope that you will adopt it and bring it into your classroom. But we wanted to kind of sort of have a testimony time to talk about what led us to Hebrew, what led us to these methods in particular, and where we're hoping that we will, the future of biblical Hebrew will go, should we be able to impact that in our own lives. Jeff, Boker Tov, good morning, my friend.
Good morning to you as well.
Well, what do you want to say to start us off?
Well, one, thank you for collaborating with me. Hebrew is, when I was an MDiv student, it was a painful course. I love my professor, T.V. Ferris. He just naturally seemed to understand how languages worked, and they just clicked for him. I later had Larry Walker at the time.
Yeah.
He was the only Semitic scholar in our convention, and he could work in and around all Semitic languages, and that just baffled me how somebody's mind could just get language like that.
Yeah.
But everything for me was just so extraordinarily difficult. I found myself memorizing things for a Friday quiz. And then by the time I walked out of class, had one cup of coffee, an hour later, I could no more have passed that quiz if my life depended on it. And it just seemed to be such an effort in futility.
Yes.
And at the time, I looked forward to pastoring, and I thought, wow, 3/4 of the Christian Bible, I don't find enjoyable. The language just seems just to kill any desire to even just want to read the Old Testament in English.
Yeah.
And I just knew there had to be a better way, but it would take a number of years before that feeling ever, and that reality ever go away. So this book, the culmination of a lot of years of blood, sweat, and tears. And I don't know what more blood or tears, but hopefully a new generation of students won't have to live through the struggles that I had to.
Yeah, I completely agree, and I resonate with the struggle. I do want to interject. Larry Walker, correct me if I'm wrong, he did doctorate work at Dropsy with, or like I should say, alongside Meredith Klein, correct?
I believe that's correct. Yes.
Man,
he definitely went to Dropsy. Yeah,
sure. Yeah, he went to Dropsy, which Dropsy I think has been subsumed by Boston College now. I think it's now the Jewish Studies Department of Boston College.
Okay.
Which is quite sad, because I would have loved to have gone and done postdoc work or something like that with them. That would be great fun. Well, so currently you are the librarian.
Yes.
At New Orleans, but you do teach. How many courses have you taught since being at New Orleans? How long have you been at New Orleans?
I came in August of 2002, so
20 years.
July of 2023, I've completed 21 years.
Hallelujah. Check that out. And they haven't killed you yet.
No, dream job, dream people. It's great.
Yeah, if you get to go to New Orleans Seminary and visit Dr. Griffin, he lives in the room with all the old books.
Oh, yes.
You have one of the best smelling offices because of the old books.
Well, John T. Christian is our namesake. He was our first church historian back when the institution was the Baptist Bible Institute. He was a bibliophile. To this day, we do not know where he got his money to travel to Europe every summer, but as a pastor in Mississippi and Arkansas, he somehow figured out a way to get the churches to give him a sabbatic every single summer. And he then would go to London to the book fairs. Being a church historian, he knew all the great names of authors, and he purchased thousands of books. About 6 months before his death, he bequeathed his entire library of around 18,000 volumes to the then Baptist Bible Institute, and that serves as the seminal collection, foundational collection of our institution.
It's phenomenal. Well, I've been at Oklahoma Baptist University now for 3 years. I came here during COVID, so the joke goes, I don't recommend a life change whenever there is a world pandemic. It makes for a very difficult first year of trying to get your feet under you and acclimate. It was difficult, and I'm grateful for the mercy and grace that my leadership over me showed me that year, because I'm sure that it was difficult dealing with me in trying to transition during that time period. Nevertheless, I'm also in my dream job as Jeff is in his at New Orleans. And so I get to teach Old Testament and Hebrew day in and day out. And it's my love. And I did also kind of sort of have the same struggle of coming to Hebrew. So let's talk about when we got exposed to Hebrew. For me personally, my first exposure to Hebrew actually came from my pastor in high school. I went to Struma Baptist Church in Baton Rouge. My pastor in high school was a gentleman named Stuart Rothberg. And if that does not sound Jewish to you, then you don't know Brooklyn Jewish names. But Stuart was raised as an Orthodox Jew. He knew the customs, the methods, the language, etc. But then when in the military, he became a believer in Jesus. And so he calls himself a completed Jew. Later became a pastor, a Southern Baptist pastor at that. And I sat under his tutelage through high school, and hearing him expound on the word, the culture, and the language led me to say, I want to do Hebrew. And so that was my real first exposure to Hebrew, but I desperately struggled with Hebrew at Samford University and then Union University and then at Mid-America thereafter. And I think probably the hardest thing for me to grasp, and I now retrospectively looking at it, understand why, was I didn't really in my mind grasp that Hebrew is a synthetic language and words want to magnetize together. And so dummy Mario would read a word and then go to the dictionary or to the lexicon and try to find it. And well, it's not there because, you know, it has a lamed and a mame and a kof added to it. And it has a new on the backside of it or something along those lines. Or maybe it was a Jonah weak verb and I just couldn't find it. And so I tried to cheat my way through my first 2 times of taking Hebrew, and that led to failure. And eventually I started wrapping my mind around, okay, this is a completely different language. I have to cut stuff apart to see the text and to read it. And really, I think for me, the aha came whenever I started vocally reading Hebrew a lot more. As a trained musician, my ears are trained to hear things. And so hearing the Hebrew allowed me to connect it to the vocabulary that I was memorizing versus just looking at it and being overwhelmed because it looks like chicken scratch on the text. So for you, Jeff, what was the hardest thing for you to get? Because you already admitted that it was difficult. What was the hardest aspect if you could nail one aspect?
That's easy, vocabulary.
Mm.
I mean, grammar, you know, every language is going to have nouns, it's going to have verbs. But the vocabulary was just so difficult. And probably 10 years after the fact, I realized that, of course, I had to look this stat up. I obviously didn't know off the top of my head, but 40% of the vocabulary in the Hebrew Bible, proper nouns, names of people, places, and things.
Yeah.
And growing up in church, I knew the basic storyline of the Bible. But I had never put together that so many of these biblical names are combinations with one of the theophoric elements. The theophoric element just being El, shortened for Elohim, Yah for Yahweh, or as our Jewish friends would say, Adonai.
Right.
But you know, like Daniel, for example, you hear the L at the end, that's God, and Don, the beginning, means to judge. And then when you look at Daniel's life, obviously he got carried to Babylon. Remarkably, though, he kept himself circumspect in a world that was very much opposed to everything he and his friends believed in. And he lived this amazingly circumspect life. But if you know his name that his parents gave him, he always remembered, you know, at the end of the day, I'm going to give account for my life, not just to me, not my parents, not the Babylonians, but ultimately to my God. And so it's just amazing to me how that I could learn the word for to judge from Daniel's own name. And then I started realizing, hey, I bet you there's a lot of names I could do this with. And so I started cataloging this. And then I realized how much vocabulary I could pick up through just the biblical names, the basic storyline of whatever happened in that person's life or at that particular location, geographical location. And suddenly I could start acquiring vocabulary virtually painlessly.
Mm-hmm.
And that is when my love for the language really kicked in, because theoretically we can all learn grammar. Grammar's grammar generally across languages,
Mm-hmm.
but until you have some basis for vocabulary, a language just can't be fun to read or to speak or have it,
Yeah, the portmanteau, right? As they say in French, the double words being added together. That is a huge thing. And for me, I think I saw that from Stuart whenever he was preaching through the Old Testament, because he would make light of the names and say, oh, look, they're going to Shechem, or they're going to Gilead, or they're going, he would point the name out and he would say, that's important to the story because that name means this. And so it brings this color to it. And I think you once upon a time told me, it's not changing the story, but it's moving it from black and white to vivid color.
Yes.
The story doesn't
Bible in color. Yeah.
Yeah, the story doesn't change. We're not undermining the text, and we're not saying that if you don't know Hebrew or Greek, you can't read the Bible either. That's one of the accusations that people levy against us Hebrew guys. That's not what we're saying. What we are saying is if you want to add some more color to the story, knowing the Greek and Hebrew of the text will benefit you tremendously. So vocab was the hardest for you. The synthetic nature was the hardest for me. I think there's many different things, and it's interesting. Having taught Hebrew multiple different semesters, each class, I don't know about your classes, but each class seems to struggle with a different thing. So one semester, for instance, I had a bunch of students that were doing really well. They didn't struggle at all for the vocab. Your method of connecting it to other words, boom, they were nailing it. But they desperately struggled to grab the grammar. By converse, this last semester's course, they had the vocab down. They had the grammar down, but they were struggling for the vocab. And so they could explain, Noah, Nimrod, they could explain Hezekiah, they could explain it all, but they were desperate to remember their vocab. And so I think what anybody that's hearing us talk, I would hope that you realize everybody's going to struggle with something different as you learn a different language.
Right.
And that's perfectly acceptable. Personally, me in reading, I had to have a tutor for reading all the way until my senior year of high school, because I am a very poor reader. A lot of people don't know that. They're like, you're in a PhD. How are you? I had to learn to train my brain to read. And naturally, I read right to left. So I guess I'm somewhat dyslexic, hence why Hebrew is a little bit easier for me. But yeah, there's many different reasons that you might struggle learning a language. And welcome to being human. So there's nothing shameful in finding what area you struggle in, and then finding somebody that can help you walk through that struggle. So, yeah. Why do you think students bemoan Hebrew? I can't tell you how many times, Jeff, I've gone to a conference, SBL, ETS, fill in the blank, or I'm at a pastor's conference and they go, what do you teach, Mario? I teach Hebrew. And immediately their smile goes to this anger, PTSD maybe from when they went through seminary. What is it about it?
I think a lot of professors just simply don't make the Old Testament relevant in general, unfortunately. And but just as far as the language itself, there's nothing in our culture that, well, obviously the Roman alphabet, Spanish uses the same alphabet basically we use, the French, Germans, et cetera, et cetera. But then when students look at Hebrew, there's what's Semitic. They've never seen anything like it. And so to see a Saudi and think TS, it's just not, there's nothing natural about that. And so I tell my students that the hardest week is your first week, not because you're just kicking off a new semester, a new course, but it is the alphabet. And if Hebrew is taught with any kind of learning method, which I think our book may be the very first Hebrew grammar ever that actually uses established pedagogical methods that educational psychologists have known about for decades. The hardest week is the first week. It's just getting your brain trained. When you see a bet, you think B, or if you see a bet with a dagesh, you think V, and it's just making that initial memorization. And hopefully after that, memorization can be limited a lot rather than just rote memory. Because for me, that was all it was. It was really a course in rote memory.
Sure.
Just general subject matter was Hebrew, but
yeah. I called the second time that I tried to take Hebrew death by paradigm. It was terrible. I think for me, maybe talking to pastors and other people at conferences, one of the reasons that they bemoaned doing Hebrew is because it sounds to me that their professors were trying to make them translators versus readers of the text. Now, as you and I both have friends that work for Tyndale and Wycliffe and other Bible translation committees, that's great. I applaud, and we need people that do that. But that's not where you start learning a language. You start learning a language by reading it. And in fact, that's how we did English, isn't it? Growing up, we read, I don't know, Dr. Seuss or Cat in the Hat and things of that sort. Exactly. And then maybe in America, we hit grammar in late third grade, maybe fourth grade.
Possibly.
So we've
been reading a long time already by then.
Yeah, you've spent a solid 6 years reading very basic English or hearing very basic English long before your parents or your teacher ever says, this is a direct object, this is a verb, this is a subject. And so I think people bemoan Hebrew, maybe even Greek, depending upon where they went, because seminary pedagogy for millennia, it seems, has been to teach people to translate the text versus reading it and enjoying it. I mean, I can read Spanish and French fluently, and I don't ever stop and ask myself, what type of a verb is this? I just don't. I just read it. I'm not doing, I mean, even those of us that read English, right? We're not stopping and going, okay, is that a participle? I don't know. Right. We don't do that. We just read the text. Right. And so I think you and I in our textbook are pushing for that. Just read God's word and pray that the Spirit of the Lord will enlighten you to the language and the text as you read through it. And I think also whenever we're pushing so hard to translate, we tend to overlook, in my opinion, the simplicity of the Hebrew text. Because English is much more complicated, grammatically speaking, than Hebrew. And there's beauty and simplicity when you're reading some of the Psalms, for instance. Our church is doing a series through the Psalms this summer, and I've been translating them for them. And there's such great beauty of the simplicity there that our English just muddies up by adding more poetic stuff. So maybe that's what it is. I don't know.
Well, speaking of the simplicity of the language, many seminary students are surprised to learn that Greek is actually far more complicated syntactically. Any language will tell you that Hebrew is far easier. So every now and then people, ask them, why on earth did you go to school to learn Hebrew? I said, because it's so easy.
Yeah.
I mean, again, once you get past the alphabet and you make that mental adjustment of these signs of letters, grammatically, overwhelming. That's far simpler than the New Testament Greek.
I tell a lot of people, it's almost a 5,000-year-old language now. It's not complicated. It was a very simple language back then. Language back then was very simplistic. So don't complicate it with modern complicated languages. Yeah. So, but yeah, definitely, I think that's true. Okay. Dr. Carl Sanders at Capital Seminary, he and numerous other people had done a 5-year study at their respective institutions, and they tested students that were graduating from MDiv, and then they tested them for 5 years thereafter to see how much they retained of their biblical Hebrew and biblical Greek. And Dr. Sanders and the other people that participated in this 5-year study found at their respective institutions that there was a less than 10% retention rate of biblical Greek and Hebrew at the end of the 5-year period. Less than 10%. And I remember I was at ETS, I think that was ETS in San Antonio, whenever he presented that paper, and the room was standing room only because we were all waiting to see the results of this test for 5 years. And he rightly said, in what occupation, other than the weatherman, do we praise a 10% success rate?
That hurts.
And yet we
It's
do
devastating.
every year. We pat each other on each other's back. You're doing great being a Hebrew or Greek prof.
Yeah.
What do you think has led to this 10% retention rate? Having taught Hebrew for 2 decades now.
Yeah. Well, again, I think so much of it has to do with our students, and frankly, the fact that the relevance of the Hebrew Bible for today. As Christians, Western Christians, it's so easy for us to move on to the New Testament. We feel very comfortable there. Most of us, if we grew up in church, 90+% of the preaching, at least I heard, was all from the New Testament. If there was an emphasis on tithing or a particular Sunday or on emphasis on sanctity of human life, there would be, key text, but by and large, very little preaching from the Old Testament.
Yeah.
And so just the motivation for students to, once they enter pastoral ministry, enter a local church ministry, again, just the stress of life, young families, you're new to ministry, you can only do so much. And so it's easy to let languages in general slip.
Yeah.
But it is remarkable while just 30 minutes a week, it is amazing how much you can retain. And then when you do have to speak week by week, preaching or teaching, then you can make use of the skills you've developed and you haven't lost them.
Yeah. I wonder if the 10% success rate, one, I think pedagogy is a huge issue. Okay.
Absolutely.
But let's set the pedagogy on the side and think about other societal or psychological things, right? I think one of the reasons why 10% success rate or retention rate is the norm is because, well, frankly, societally speaking, America has touted itself as being a monolinguistic nation for so long.
Sure.
Whereas in other countries, for instance, our preaching professor here, Dr. David Gambo, he's from Nigeria. His father works for Wycliffe Bible translators. And so he grew up around a dad that could fluently read Greek and Hebrew because he was translating the text. And David grew up speaking, I think, 4 different Nigerian languages. And so whenever he went to seminary, he just smoked. I mean, like, he had not a problem with Greek and Hebrew because he was already thinking multilinguistically.
Sure.
Whereas I tend to see my students that are monolinguistic and have that, we're America, we speak English, that mentality, they bemoan learning another language and they don't retain learning another language. I think, and I hope, maybe this kind of flows ultimately into our further question down the line, but I think and I hope that the diversification of the linguistic culture of America is going to affect and bring about good retention and changes and pedagogical differences of biblical Greek and biblical Hebrew. I think also, and you did postdoc work in Israel, and I've gone over as well and done study. I think modern Israel's influence to the broader Christian world and video and translation work, etc., will alleviate some of the disconnectivity and where we tend to say, well, this is Hebrew from a long, long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. Wait, that's Star Wars. But whereas no, modern Hebrew is really close to biblical Hebrew. And I was absolutely amazed walking around with my wife all last summer in Israel, translating at the bus stop or at the subway or at the university, etc. I'm going, I actually understand a lot of this stuff. There was a girl that was on the phone, a lady, I should say, at Jerusalem Museum, the National Museum, and she was calling to find out about when we would be permitted to come in because sadly that day Joe Biden had locked down the museum to go tour, and my wife and I had gone there and we were like, we want to go tour, and she was like, I don't know, I can't let you in because Secret Service, yada yada. And so she gets on the phone and she's talking in modern Hebrew, and I understood about half of the conversation, and afterwards she goes, well, this is what they said, and I was like, can I try? And I said this, and she goes, how'd you understand that? You know Hebrew? I was like, enough. So I think maybe the revival with the Zionist movement and modern Hebrew will bring Hebrew back into vogue throughout Christendom. Some of my friends say that's happening as well with modern Greek as well, but 10% is atrocious.
Well, I think part of that is that when you look at almost, well, to me, every grammar, they spread like verbs through the entire book. They will spread prepositions throughout the entire book rather than teaching things holistically together.
Yep.
And again, I don't know of any grammar that does what ours does, is that so all the grammars historically, they teach things in isolation. And when you do that, then people cannot make the connection and the logic, like with all the verbs, the logic with all the prepositions, etc. So yeah, that really contributes to the lack of retention, and two, I think just the love of the language, that it just seems to be buckshot. The grammar is just buckshot against the wall, and of course it's a coherent whole to the professor. He or she's been teaching or reading this 20, 25 years.
Right.
But when you're in your first or second semester, the buckshot approach to just in any given chapter, 3 or 4 or 5 things are covered, taught in complete isolation, and then bits and pieces of that same part of speech is found in 7 or 8 other chapters.
Right.
Frankly, that's just total incoherence.
Right.
And it's no wonder smart. I mean, if you're going to college, especially graduate school, you are smart just by definition. And it's no wonder the retention is so bad when we have this buckshot approach to presenting grammar in a book.
Right. So what do you think is the future of biblical Hebrew?
Well, hopefully people will see our approach using very concrete, well-established teaching theory, and others will join us in the future. Obviously, there's a lot of great teaching theories out there. Ours with the collaborative rehearsal is just one of obviously many, and I'm certainly not a educational psychologist, but in this sense, we're pioneers and trying to present Hebrew grammar in this way, and hopefully others will join us and just improve upon this, so that the Hebrew is a fun course from the get-go, not just a drudgery that, well, okay, I'm an MDiv student at a seminary or Bible college, and this is just a course I have to take to get my piece of paper, even though we're all sitting here thinking this is a big fat waste of our time.
Yeah, definitely.
When in fact it isn't. I mean, anytime, even non-verbally, we communicate to our students that 3/4 of their Christian canon in its original is not worth the time of day. Oh, that's not an indictment on them. That's an indictment on the academy.
Yeah,
Full stop.
Definitely. Did you ever hear the story about R.C. Sproul and how he became really good at Greek and not Hebrew?
No, I've not heard that. Tell me.
So I went to Ligonier maybe a decade ago, and R.C. was sitting up on the stage with the other pastors and professors, and one of them said, "R.C., why are you so good at Greek and not Hebrew?" And he said, "Well, he was in his MDiv work, I think it was, and he was invited to fly somewhere to speak for the PCA, the Presbyterian Church. And so he shows up to the airport and is checking his luggage, and his luggage is overweight. And the lady checking him in at the desk says, Mr. Sproul, you have to pull stuff out. Like, you're overweight on your luggage." And he had in his luggage his big Tanakh and a lexicon. And he says he pulled them out and left them at the desk and never picked Hebrew up again.
No. Oh, wow.
Sadly, I think that is a metaphorical equivalence to what many of our students do.
Yeah.
That they feel as though it is too much, it's too heavy, I can't carry it, etc. So here, let's think through about like recommendations for Hebrew students, or those that have already taken Hebrew, maybe in seminary, and they've bemoaned it and they're wanting to come back to it, because I'm hoping that our videos and our book will be a resource that a lot of people that already went through seminary and they're like, man, that was a decade ago, I don't remember my Hebrew, yada yada. Great, pick ours up. Walk through that. It's 12 simple lessons. Hopefully it'll revive Hebrew for you. But contrary to what Dr. Sproul went through, I think one of the best things that we have available to us now are these devices in our hands. And what I recommend to students, as well as to pastors and other people, is that you download an interlinear Bible app. This is the one for the Android phone, because I have an Android. And simply, whenever I go to church, if I'm not preaching, I will have my English paper Bible in hand, and I will also have this one open to the text on the other side. And I will read. I've trained my mind and my eyes to read either the Greek or the Hebrew and not the English. But if I don't know the vocabulary word, I look to the English. It expedites it, it speeds it up. And this is always in my pocket, unlike R.C. Sproul's Tanakh that got left at an airport. The other two resources that I recommend for people coming back to Hebrew or learning Hebrew, one is Exegetical Gems of Biblical Hebrew. This book is chapter by chapter about the grammar. And so this particular grammatical thing is important. And here's why for your Bible study. Here's why for your preaching. So it takes what we're teaching and it says, look, it really matters. And here's several passages that it matters. Have you messed with this book, Jeff?
It's been a number of years since I've looked at it, but it's a good resource. Absolutely.
Yeah. So my students have to, as they go through our textbook, they have to do write-up summaries of the chapter that shows why that grammatical principle matters for exegesis, which I think is good, because again, it's showing that it matters. The Old Testament is applicable, things of that sort. So the other thing that I also recommend, and then I'll let you throw stuff out there, is this book, 70 Hebrew Words That Every Christian Should Know. And much like our text, it goes through the different words and it will give you the word. It'll give you what it means if it's a portmanteau, if it's two words jammed together or something else. And it helps us understand exegetically why that word matters to that particular story, text, verse, whatever the case is. Again, dragging it from just, oh, I'm just learning another language, to, oh, wow, we're adding color to the stories that we already know. So I think that's the three things that I would recommend to people to retain their Hebrew. Read Hebrew every day. That's my main punchline. Ivrit kol yom, right? Hebrew every day. And do it interlinearly. It expedites you being able to read it and enjoy it. And so every night, whenever I lay down in bed, I open up my Hebrew Bible app, my interlinear one, and I read through it. And so one of my students and I are reading through Joshua currently. He already finished Hebrew with me, but he said, Doc, I want to continue reading. Can we read together and meet up once in a while and talk about it? Yeah, let's do it. So those are my recommendations for students to retain and further their Hebrew. What do you have?
Well, it's kind of like with realtors, they say location. Well, for biblical Hebrew, it's just read.
Yeah.
And again, ever so briefly, tell our audience about the Hamiltonian system that
sure
fell out of vogue years ago, but hopefully our book is trying to revive that a little bit.
Yeah. So James Hamilton, not the guy from the play, but James Hamilton, a Englishman back in the 1760, I think it was. He and other people that were they were tutors for the royals, and their job was to teach the royals Latin and Russian and all these other languages. That way the royals were able to go over to mainland Europe and converse. He espoused a method of interlinear reading so that they could read the Russian, French, or Latin was his principal. He was principally working in Latin, but there was other people working with him and others. And so he would espouse that they read the target language, is what we would call it. But right below that, he would also have the English word, so that way it could expeditiously read through it and they could enjoy the text. Whereas the first two times that I took Hebrew, reading my Hebrew Bible, literally I was told just go buy a Tanakh, right? A BHS with all of these notes everywhere. And oh my goodness, it's so overwhelming.
It is.
And I felt like I was reading more of the dictionary than the Bible.
Yes.
And I mean, I remember being at Mid-America Seminary and spending 4 hours just thumbing through a lexicon to just translate so that I could just read the passage.
Right.
Whereas the Hamiltonian method says, let's read the passage interlinearly, but as your vocabulary grows, I will start deleting, for lack of better terms, deleting the English words because you now know the target language word instead. And so it ingrains into us the target language and its equivalents of English. It ingrains into us subconsciously the syntax, the flow of our target language, and it ingrains into us reading, and it makes it enjoyable and fun. And so I don't actually require of my students that they buy a BHS. I require that they buy Crossway's Crossway's Reader Bible.
Right.
But they don't buy that till their second semester. Their first semester, they're using our textbook, which is the Hamiltonian method. By the time they hit second semester, they have enough vocabulary in their minds to use a Crossway reader of the Hebrew text.
But
So,
bottom line, it's a method that if it's good enough for the royal family, that should tell you something, because they're
yeah,
going to have the best tutors in the world at the time.
yeah. And it's only come back into vogue in the last 30 years or 20 years, I would say, in linguistics. And that's really because of the ease of utilizing computers to type interlinearly.
Sure.
Whereas before, printing presses hated doing that.
Yeah.
So
Pretty nightmare, for sure.
read is your recommendation. I agree to that. And if you feel frustrated reading a text that is a more difficult text, go back and grab some easy narrative. I remember I was taking Near Eastern background. No, I was taking Northwestern Semitic literature with Dr. Cole at New Orleans Seminary, and I was reading Hebrew along with it. And we got to a point, and I just felt defeated. And so I remember going to Dr. Cole's office, and I said, Dr. Cole, I have to admit defeat. I have to admit I don't know Hebrew. Apparently, I've been faking it. And he starts laughing at me, Jeff. He starts laughing at me. This sweet man that I love so desperately is laughing at me in my face. And I said, Dr. Cole, what? And he says, Mario, here's what I want you to do. Just go read the book of Judges this weekend. And if you still feel the same way on Monday, come back and tell me. Well, yeah, we were translating really difficult stuff in Hebrew. And whenever I went and read basic narrative, I went, oh, okay, I actually know this. The really difficult stuff with the one-time used words. Yeah, of course.
Right.
Unless you've memorized that list, you're going to feel very defeated.
Sure.
So read. So last question before we split our way. What is your favorite Hebrew passage and why?
When I was in the third grade, my parents had me go to a private Christian school,
Yeah.
and part of the curriculum is we had to memorize at least one verse a week. And so then it was with the Bible Memory Association. I don't know if they still exist or not, but if
Okay.
you memorize at least 10 verses, you got some kind of award or a little gift, or 15, 20. And so in any event, I can't remember how many verses I memorized, but I got this little bitty felt back in the days when kids like felt little thing I could put on my wall.
Yeah.
It was Psalm 37:4. Delight yourself also in the Lord, and he will give you the desires of your heart.
Yeah.
And that was on my wall as a third grader until the day I got married at age 22. So when I was in college, it looked pretty weird to have felt, the small little felt sign on my wall, but I love the verse, so it wasn't coming down.
Yeah.
And I love that first word, delight, because it's in the Hithpalel stem in Hebrew, which is an action you do for your own benefit.
Yeah, that's good.
And it has this root idea of being tender or vulnerable. But how do we get to know somebody? We have to be vulnerable.
Yeah.
We have to show our more delicate side, or we might say we have to expose our heart to somebody. We really have to just be ourselves. And this idea of pursuing God, well, it's this love relationship. And so this idea, but at the end of the day, it's about God. It's not about Jeff, but there still is this idea that whenever I do pray, so many times my circumstances don't change, or that person doesn't change, but Jeff is the one that changes. And so, yeah, it does make me tender, it does make me vulnerable. And but this idea of delighting in God, that this idea of happiness, never met anybody that didn't want to be happy.
Right.
Yet the God of the universe wants me to find pursuing him as the most lovely, most beautiful thing imaginable, person imaginable.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, you know, God, it never changes. But in pursuing him, it's the Hithball. It changes Jeff. It impacts me.
Yeah.
And so I've just always loved that idea that our God is an incurably happy God. So many people read the Old Testament and don't see that at all.
Right.
But he very much is. And we are to join him in his delight, which is himself, the highest good, the highest righteousness. And at the end of the day, but I delight myself. This is me.
Yeah. Mine actually comes, no surprise, from Habakkuk, which was my dissertation field.
I was about to say, that sounds familiar.
Yeah, very, very familiar. Jeff was one of my readers, but for me, it's actually from the Psalm of Habakkuk, chapter 3. My dad, whenever I was growing up in Baton Rouge, my dad had 4 Israeli fig trees. And so they produced those really golf ball sized figs, and boy, they were juicy and sweet. I remember being a little boy going out there and picking them and just mashing it fresh onto a piece of toast and eating it. And having been in Israel and seen all those fig trees just growing wild all over the place, it's incredible. But we see there in chapter 3 a psalm that I most relate to, because I remember after Hurricane Katrina hit and a couple other hurricanes coming through, my dad's fig trees that year didn't produce because they were inundated by water or something along those lines. And so verse 17 for me, just even the beginning of it, right? Though the fig tree does not blossom, you jump down to 18. I will exalt in Yahweh. I will exalt him in the God of my salvation. And so it's literally, that was the passage that came to my mind post Katrina, because dad's trees didn't produce. But yet the Lord had saved us through that storm and many others. And so for me, I think that's the really amen cool thing. And it's quickly being replaced, though, by the end of the book of Ruth. The passage that it says, and the women came to Naomi and said, "Blessed are you, Naomi, for the Lord has not left you without a redeemer. And my baby girl's middle name is Naomi." So, or Noemi, which is the Spanish version. And so I think hopefully that will be her life verse, that she'll always remember that she has a redeemer. So maybe that passage will replace my Habakkuk 3 for my daughter's sake. So, yeah, nevertheless. Well, anything else you would like to say before we part our ways?
Well, I've just enjoyed this. Thank you.
Alrighty. Yes, sir. It's great. And I hope that if anybody watching this has questions or whatever, just reach out to us. You can find our institutional emails on our respective schools at New Orleans Baptist Theological Seminary or at Oklahoma Baptist University. Email us. We'd love to talk Hebrew with you. I'm certain of that fact. And if you see us at ETS, SBL, other conferences, pastor conferences, whatever, please tell us that these things have been helpful to you, or even suggest changes, because we are not infallible. I guarantee there's things that we have said or done that needs to be revised, because there's only one that is good, and that is the Lord, as Christ says, and he is Lord. All right. Well, we'll go ahead and stop right here, and we will talk to you all soon. Have a great day, everybody.